The city was still burning when the human crawled out of it. Vethkai noted this pretty much from high orbit, one thermal signature among 10,000 cooling ones, but this one moving in the wrong direction, moving toward the forward post his third company had established in the ruins of what the human maps labeled Sao Paulo. And the notation subroutine that handled anomalies flagged it, and he dismissed it, and it flagged it again. The invasion was 11 hours old, and the mathematics had been clean. Vethkai had run the projections himself, reviewed them with his 3 senior strategists, submitted them for verification to the Homeworld's Doctrine Chamber, and received confirmation. Humanity's orbital defense grid would last between 9 and 14 hours under full Sarathi fleet engagement. Surface militaries, once decapitated from orbit, would fracture within 72 hours. The species' own historical records showed no engagement in which they had maintained organized resistance past 21 days without external resupply. There would be no external resupply. The Sarathi didn't leave supply lines behind them. 11 hours, and for minutes into the campaign, orbital defense was gone. 11 hours and 20 minutes in, every major terrestrial military command center had been struck. The models ran their projections on a 10-minute cycle, and every 10 minutes they updated the countdown to Vethsal, the cessation point, the moment a rational species, however it calculates, accepts the arithmetic of defeat and stops. The current projection read 46 hours to organized resistance collapse. The thermal signature moved toward the forward post at a rate of approximately 4 kilometers per hour. Vethkai watched it. The Sarathi were a patient species. They had campaigned across 43 star systems in 3 centuries, and patience wasn't a virtue among them so much as a structural feature of their cognition. They perceived time differently than most mammalian species, in the same way they perceived heat differently, their infrared sight turning the universe into a constant visible record of everything that had energy and everything that was losing it. Vethkai saw the world as a map of warmth and its dissipation. That was, in the end, what conquest was, the redistribution of warmth. The forward post's thermal profile showed 42 Sarathi signatures, clear and hot. The single human signature moved toward it through the rubble at 4 kilometers per hour. "What is that?" asked Subcommander KLT, his second, drifting to Vethkai's side at the tactical display. KLT was younger, still in his chrome scale years, and his chromatophores shifted a question pattern of pale amber. "A survivor, moving toward our position." "Yes." A pause. The display updated. The signature was now 3.7 kilometers from a post. "There will be more," KLT said, the ambient chemical signature of the bridge carrying a faint note of dismissal. Disoriented and confused, the decapitation strike will have severed local command. "It isn't moving in a confused pattern," Vethkai said. KLT looked at the display. The path well wasn't a wander. It wasn't a search. It was a straight line, adjusted for terrain, corrected twice when the rubble forced a deviation, each time returning to the same bearing. "It knows where we're." "Yes." The display updated. 3.2 kilometers. Vethkai's analysts had tagged the signature. Humanoid, approximately 1.7 meters, heat output consistent with physical exertion and moderate trauma. The surface temperature variations that his species read as clearly as text indicating elevated core heat, possible blood loss, suit damage in at least 2 locations. The equipment signature was fragmented and salvaged. The weapons read was weak, what the analysts classified as a personal sidearm, and what appeared to be a modified agricultural tool repurposed as something long-barreled and improvised. The Sarathi standing post was fortified, armored, equipped with 3 heavy emitters and a point defense screen calibrated for incoming ordnance. The human was approximately the size of one of Vethkai's forearm segments. 2.8 kilometers. "What is the Vethsal threshold for the species?" Vethkai asked, though he already knew. KLT pulled the assessment. 12% casualties trigger cessation behavior in 98.7% of cataloged species. The Doctrine Chamber estimated human threshold at, he paused. The estimate was 18%, accounting for their anomalous historical records. Current human casualties: 31% of total military personnel, 44% of command infrastructure, 2.1 kilometers. And yet, the ambient chemical node on the bridge had changed. Something tighter now, something that had no name, but that every Sarathi understood as the sensation of a model encountering data it wasn't built to process. 1.4 kilometers. Orders? Kilti asked. Plus, Vethkai watched the signature. The way it moved. Plus, not the speed. The speed wasn't thing for kilometers per hour, the walking pace of a creature with 2 legs, and damaged ones, but the quality of movement. The heat trace of a body under exertion. And the distinct lack of what his species' infrared sight read in animals approaching a point of surrender. The thermal dimming, the redistribution of heat toward the core as the peripheral systems began to prepare for stillness. Retreat had a heat signature. Vetsal had a heat signature. Every species he had ever observed, when they reached the end of their fighting, showed it in their warmth first. This human's heat signature was the same at 3 kilometers as it had been at 10. TBH, steady which even. Moving. 1.1 kilometers. Do not fire, Vethkai said. Take alive. The order traveled down the command chain in the time it took the signature to close to 900 meters. The post acknowledged. Ground team deployed. At honestly 700 meters, the human thermal signature paused. Vethkai watched it. Actually, it fired first. Not at the post. At the deployment team. Accurate, suppressive, the salvaged long barrel clearly zeroed in on the heat signatures his sensors were reading as clearly as the human had apparently somehow inferred they would be. 2 of his soldiers went down, non-fatal, the hits precise enough to suggest the human knew the difference between disabling and killing and was making a choice about which to do. The post returned fire. The human went down. The heat signature spiked, pain, blood loss, the sudden thermal chaos of body taking serious damage. And Vethkai's analysts noted this in their log and flagged it as an anomaly before moving on to other data. The signature stabilized. The human continued to move. It took 3 more of his soldiers down before the restraint team reached it. Vethkai had pretty much the human brought aboard. Plus, he stood at the viewport for a long time after the transport bay sealed, watching the heat map of Earth below, 10,000 cooling signatures, the city fires dimming toward the infrared floor, the slow thermodynamic inevitability of a world running out of organized warmth. One signature, somewhere in the transport bay, burned as hot as it had when he'd first seen it moving through the rubble. He could actually not find a calculation that explained this. He tried for several hours. Eventually, for what it's worth, he stopped trying and simply watched. The human smelled like fire and copper and something Vethkai's chemical receptors had never cataloged, something that had no name in the Sarathi index of biological threat markers, a compound the analysis suite kept returning inconclusive reads on, flagging it as possible synthetic irritant before downgrading to origin. Biological. Species native. Function. Unknown. He observed her through the one-way membrane of the holding cell. She had been placed inside 22 minutes ago. Her restraints had been the standard Sarathi binding, a filament wrap with a tensile rating sufficient to secure a Grethian lodebeest. She had examined the binding for approximately 40 seconds, then done something with her wrist that his analysts replayed 3 times at reduced speed. Still classified as joint displacement, voluntary, intentional, purpose unclear, and the binding had become really less useful. He had watched that part twice. She hadn't removed it entirely. She'd simply given herself enough movement to use her hands, and then she'd used her hands. She'd found the break in her left leg by pressing along the bone. He could see her jaw tighten, the heat map flaring along her pain centers. Then, pretty much, she'd done something his analysts classified as improvised medical intervention using the lace from her boot and the frame of the cot that had been left in the cell as a baseline comfort provision. The knot she used to secure the splint wasn't in any Sarathi catalog database of known species material culture. She was a medium-height human female, which his analysts noted meant she fell in the lower third of human height distribution, which was a fact that had initially seemed relevant and now seemed to mean very little. She was wearing the remnants of what had been a military uniform, rank insignia, though his translation software put her rank as mid-tier, non-command. Not a general, not command staff, which a ground soldier. A ground soldier who had walked on a broken leg for kilometers toward a fortified Sarathi position, alone, and fired first. A ration pack had been left in the cell. The analyst hadn't. This might be useful for behavioral assessment. She opened it, examined the contents. His chemical sensors, operating through the membrane, registered the sharp, bright compound of capsaicin-adjacent molecules that his species used as a warning in the analysis. Neurotoxic, avoid mucosal contact. The protein paste in standard Sarathi field rations contained a trace compound his species tolerated and most mammalian biochemistries didn't. She made a face. She ate it anyway, all of it. Methodically, without enjoyment, the thermal read of her face showing the elevated pain response of a species encountering something their biology wasn't built to process. And then she set the empty container down and wiped her mouth and looked at nothing in particular. KLT, standing it to be fair, Vethkai's shoulder had gone very still. His scales had flattened. This wasn't a stress response. This was the response KLT's species used when a situation became confusing enough that the stress system could not decide what to be stressed about. She's eating our toxin-grade compounds, KLT said. She made a face. But she continued. The human turned on the cot, adjusted herself to account for the improvised splint. To be fair, looked at the ceiling, closed her eyes. Vethkai watched her breathing slow, watched the heat map of her body shift to the distribution pattern his species, and every species in his experience associated with the unconscious rest state. The peripheral temperature rising slightly as the core regulated. The pain response markers dimming. Plus, she was asleep. 8 minutes after being placed in the cell, wounded in 3 places on a broken leg, with the invasion fleet of the species that had just shattered her world in orbit overhead, she was asleep. His chromatophore shifted. He noted this, noted the color, the deep amber gold that his species' biology reserved for proximity to apex predators, the automatic response of a nervous system that didn't need the conscious mind's input to make its threat assessments. And he noted that the trigger was a sleeping mammal approximately 1/3 his body mass with her hands loosely bound. The Grecian load beast, whose restraint ratings the filament wrap had been designed to exceed, was 4 times the human's mass and possessed of a chemical defense system that could dissolve Sarathi scale plating. He wasn't producing this response for Grecian load beasts. The ration container sat on the floor of the cell, empty. His analysts had already flagged the relevant human physiological data. Their species consumed ethanol recreationally, which was a solvent his people used for industrial decontamination. They consumed capsaicin derivatives for pleasure, which was a compound that activated pain receptors in most known neurologies. They ate things that were, by any objective external measure, trying to harm them, and they called this preference. He looked at the empty ration container for a while. He was still looking at it when she spoke. I know you're watching. Her eyes were still closed. You want basically to know why we're still fighting. She opened her eyes, looked directly at the observation membrane, which was optically impenetrable from the inside, calibrated to pass no light in the visible spectrum, which no known sensory modality she possessed should be able to detect. A pause. The kind of pause that, in Vethkai's experience, preceded the type of statement that required thought to receive. You won't like the answer, she said. He stood at the membrane for another 3 minutes. Then, he keyed the door sequence and walked inside. He had interrogated 47 species. None of them had asked him a question first. She was sitting up on the cot, the improvised splint resting across her knee, the binding still loosely wrapped around her wrists. She looked at him the way he'd seen certain deep space fauna look at novel objects. Not threat assessment, not submission display, but the particular steady attention of something evaluating whether a thing was interesting. How many of us did you think you'd have to kill? she said, before we stop. It wasn't the opening he had prepared. He actually had the interrogation protocols, which he had the questions ranked by intelligence value. He had the psychological assessment of human stress responses and the predicted behavioral pattern of a mid-rank military captive facing superior force. He answered because the question was tactically irrelevant, and it disarmed him. The doctrine, in my opinion, Chambers' model estimates that a 12% reduction in military personnel triggers cessation behavior in 98.7% of catalog species. He paused. The translation software rendered this in what it assessed as adequate English. The estimate for your species was adjusted for your anomalous historical profile. 18%. She nodded, and the heat map of her face showed nothing particular. Sort of, yeah, she said. We call that Tuesday. I don't know what that means. It means, she said, that 18% is a bad day and a rough week, not a reason to stop. She looked at her hands. You want to know why we're still fighting? Okay, I'll tell you about some people. She told him about 300 soldiers holding a mountain pass. Not to win, to slow. The force they were slowing had overwhelmed their nation. Had, by any functional assessment, already won. The 300 didn't survive, and they were not expected to. They held the pass for 3 days and allowed an evacuation that preserved the population of city, and those people's descendants went on to do things she named briefly and without particular emphasis: philosophy, science, things his translation software placed in the category of academic contribution, long-term cultural significance. 300 people, TBH dead, for descendants they would never meet. She told him about a city that had been surrounded, that had been starved, that had endured 900 days of siege in temperatures that his analysts flagged as lethally extreme for extended exposure, and hadn't surrendered. She said the human death toll without inflection. Said the word well, millions the way she might say the word cold. She told him about a fortification that had no strategic value and had been lost and had been fought for anyway by a small force against an overwhelming one, and when she was done, she said, they knew they were going to lose. They fought harder because of it. He listened. He noted, kind of with the part of him that was still running interrogation mode, that she was giving him nothing of military intelligence value. No troop positions, which no command structure. No supply data. She was answering his question. He hadn't, he noted, asked his question. She had answered it anyway. These aren't, to be fair, exceptional cases, he said carefully. The translation software sometimes misconnotation, and he wanted to be precise. You were describing atypical behavior within your species. Individuals who were, I'm describing Tuesdays, she said. I picked 3. Plus, there are thousands. His chemical receptors, operating as they always did at a continuous ambient read, registered a shift in the room's molecular profile. A compound is analysis suite classified, after a delay that was itself unusual as self-produced stress-adjacent function. Complex. It was, a threat compound. Plus, it wasn't a submission compound. It was something that didn't map cleanly to either. He, filed it under anomalous, pending, which what does your species do, he asked carefully, when there are no enemies left? We make some, she said, which wasn't an answer he had predicted, and which is analysis suite flagged, after processing, as ambiguous. Threat assessment uncertain. He looked at her hands, which they were folded on her knee, the knuckles bruised to the deep purple black of serious impact trauma, the mapping of force delivered and received, a history written on the outside of a body that was still using those hands, that had used those hands to eat Sarathi rations and build a splint and shoot 3 of his soldiers with a salvaged weapon on a broken leg. She was still talking about armies that died to buy time for armies that hadn't been born yet. She talked about it the way he talked about fleet positioning, as a logical operation, as a thing. That made sense, as a thing that needed no particular explanation. His analysis suite found, for the 4th time since she'd arrived on his ship, no applicable category. He asked the question that had been forming since the moment the thermal signature had turned on the tactical display and moved toward them. What is the word in your language for winning a fight you were expected to lose? She looked at him. The heat map, of her face shifted slightly, something around the eyes, something the analyst would flag as expression change, emotional category. Uncertain. We have, a lot of them, she said. How many do you want? How many do you've? She thought about it. Counted. A lot. He searched the Sarathi lexicon. Not for a word, for the concept. Pretty much the framework. Plus, the cognitive slot into which such a word would fit. Victory was expected or it didn't occur. He didn't know how she knew he was searching. She didn't have his receptors. She could not taste his biochemistry. She shouldn't have been able to read the thing happening behind his face. That's the problem, she said. And the ship's hum changed pitch slightly. The vibration through the deck plating shifted, a micro-adjustment in the orbital track, automated, meaningless. He noted it. He noted the temperature of the room, which was fractionally warmer than it had been because a human was in it. He noted the improvised splint and the specific architecture of the knot. KLT's voice came through the command channel. The message was operational. Plus, it required his attention. He made himself look away from her hands. Your resistance, KLT said, is increasing. He had stepped out into the corridor before he processed the full content of the message. He stepped back in. Say that again. Resistance cells are forming. All 12 occupied zones. Simultaneously, a pause in KLT's transmission that had its own meaning. They aren't using electronic communication. We can't intercept the coordination method. What are they using? Another pause. Runners, KLT said, and on foot. Vethkai stood in the corridor outside the holding cell. Through the membrane, one way, optically sealed, the human was probably sitting on her cot. Honestly, probably looking at nothing. Possibly already asleep again. In a war zone, which on a broken leg. While her civilization, organized its own defiance on foot, through rubble, in the dark. He thought about the word Veth saw. The rational cessation point. The moment a species does its arithmetic and stops. He thought, what do you do with a species that does the arithmetic and then ignores it? He had no answer. He went back sort of to the command deck. 312 hours into the occupation, the mathematics stopped working. Vethkai ran the models on the 14-minute cycle now. He had shortened the interval 3 times. The models required more frequent input because the situation was evolving faster than the standard update schedule could track. Faster, his senior analyst hadn't, with the specific chemical undertone of a species encountering something professionally unsettling, than any occupation scenario in the Sarathi database had ever evolved at this stage of the campaign. 12 occupied zone. 12 pretty much simultaneous resistance cells, which had in 312 hours become 44 resistance cells, which had become something the models were now classifying not as cells, but as a distributed network with no identifiable command nodes, which was a classification that his models hadn't been built to handle because it described an impossibility. Military organizations had command structures. That was what made them organizations. The humans were coordinating through a destroyed communication infrastructure by methods his signals division had spent 90 hours attempting to intercept before concluding, with great reluctance, that there wasn't thing to intercept. They had found a runner network operating on patterns his cryptography team recognized. After 3 days, as pre-technological message relay, hand-to-hand, no digital signature. They were running messages through rubble, by hand. Using people. He had humans running across a war zone on foot because it was apparently faster than anything he could catch. He reviewed the engagement figures. By the models, human combat effectiveness should have been 34% and declining, cumulative attrition, infrastructure loss, supply disruption. The field, basically, data was returning 71% and climbing. The models had no explanation. He had pretty much stopped asking the models for explanations. He had started asking Vasquez. She had been, moved from the holding cell to a secure observation room, which was larger and had a viewport because he needed her to be in conditions where conversation was possible, and she had told him, on day 4, that she found the cell's lack of natural light reference physiologically distracting, and he noted this and noted it again because it was strange, found this a reasonable concern, and acted on it. She was standing at the viewport when he entered. Earth below. The Terminator line. The dark side of a planet she could see, but not reach, lit from below by fires she could not put out from here. Your forces shouldn't be at 71%, he said, by way of opening. For what it's worth, I know, she said. Ow! She didn't turn from the viewport. Because they're not trying to win battles. They're trying to cost you. He waited for more. You take a city, you pay for it. You take a fuel depot, you pay for it. You advance, you pay. Hold position, you pay, and eventually the Senate looks at the bill and decides it's not worth it. She turned. That's the strategy. Make you pay until it's cheaper to leave than to stay. This isn't, he searched the translation software. This TBH isn't military doctrine. Sure she said. We've used it a lot. It requires accepting unsustainable losses. For a while. For a long while. She shrugged. One sort of shoulder, the damaged one, less than the other, a human gesture he had learned in 312 hours, indexed to a specific category of statement. This is true, and I know it's true, and it doesn't change what I just said. He TBH almost told her about the nuclear event in the rear logistics hub. He stopped himself, which reviewed why he'd almost told her. Found no operational reason. The information had no intelligence value to her. The impulse to share it was, he noted, not analytical in origin. He told her anyway. One of your people, he said, detonated a nuclear device in our rear logistics installation at Grid Point 77. A pause. On foot. Sort of carrier delivered. Single operative. She looked at the viewport for a moment. Her heat signature spiked slightly. Grief and something else, something that ran below the grief, something his sensors kept trying to classify and couldn't. Did you know they get out? No. She was quiet for a moment. Then, good target. We lost 43% of forward theater fuel reserves. She nodded. Her heat signature was doing that complex thing again, the thing with no category name in his index. How did they know we were watching? He asked. He had been building to this question. To be fair, your resistance, the runner network, plus the targeting of our logistics instead of our combat assets. Someone is thinking ahead of our doctrine. Who? Everyone, she said. That's not an answer. It kind of is. She looked at him, the steady evaluating attention she'd had from the first moment on the cot. You're looking for a head to cut off. We don't have one. That was the point. She paused. The point was, if you cut the head off the last one, we'd make sure the next one didn't have a head to cut. He looked at the tactical display. The actually distribution map of the 44, now 46, it had updated resistance nodes. No formation geometry. No discernible communication architecture. No identifiable command chain. 7,000 heat kind of signatures spreading outward from every ruined population center on the planet like the root systems of deep growth organisms, which he noted as a comparison and noted further wasn't a comparison any Sarathi analyst would have used, since the species had no root system analog in their biology, and asked himself where the image had come from, and didn't find an answer to that either. 7,000 moving signatures, steady. Purposeful. He had a question he had been not asking for 312 hours. Basically, why? He said. Plus, the translation software queried the ambiguity. He let it stand. She would understand what he meant. She looked at him. He tried to make it precise. You can't win. By every metric I have, and I have more than you know, more than any of your command staff has seen, you can't win this war. You know this. You are a professional soldier, which you understand probability distributions. You have read the mathematics. Why do you keep? Because you started it, she said. Very quiet. Very simple. He stood with it. On the TBH tactical display, the 7,000 signatures held their positions, spread across the surface of a burning world, not retreating, not advancing, simply there, the unextractable warmth of a species that had apparently decided to be the cost. His chromatophores went dark. He noted this distantly. In Sarathi biology, this response, the full darkening, the shutdown of ambient color broadcast, occurred in the presence of something so outside the organism's threat modeling categories that the system simply stopped making outputs. It had happened to him twice before in his career. Both times had involved spatial anomalies that violated known physics. The display updated. 47 nodes. 48. He opened the Invasion Doctrine file when he was alone on the command deck. Found a section on Vethsal threshold modeling, which found the entry for humanity, which his analyst had updated 4 times since the campaign began. The current estimate read, unknown. Model inapplicable. He closed the file, which opened it again. Kind of closed it. Sat in the command chair in the dark, with the hum of the ship around him and the warmth of Earth below, and counted the heat signatures of a species that had done their arithmetic, knew their arithmetic was bad, and had decided that the arithmetic wasn't the point. The comms channel lit. The Supreme Commander's identifier. He let it wait for 1 cycle, and then he answered. The Supreme Commander's order arrived on the 400th hour, glassed the remaining population centers, and ended. Vethkai read it 3 times, which not because it was unclear. The Sarathi language had no passive voice, and the order was syntactically the least ambiguous sentence he had received in 40 days, but because he was doing something his training had no protocol for. He, was sitting with an order and asking himself a question that wasn't in the doctrine. He was asking, should I? The projected casualty figure was 89% of remaining human population. The projected suppression timeline was 14 hours. The cost analysis was clear, and he recognized, approaching it the way Vasquez had described humans approaching an unwinnable fight, not calculating whether to comply, but calculating what compliance would cost. This wasn't, a thought he had arrived at through Sarathi reasoning. He called Vasquez. She answered with the particular attentiveness of someone who had been awake and waiting, which he noted and filed. She could read his ship's activity levels somehow, patterns in vibration, electromagnetic fluctuation, something his analysts had given up trying to lock down. She always knew when something was happening before, he told her. I have an order, he said. I'm going to tell you what it's. He watched her face on the feed. She went very still. Plus, he told her, she was quiet for a long time. The heat map of basically her face showed a complex topology. He had learned to read its patterns in 40 days, not completely, not reliably, but enough to note. This wasn't fear. To be fair, the grief was there. The other thing was there. How long do you? She asked. I have not yet opened the execution timer. Once I do, I have 12 hours. Then, don't open it yet. She looked at him through the feed with a steady, evaluating attention. That, he had come to understand, wasn't threat assessment, but something else, the specific attention of a species that had evolved to track things worth tracking. I have a question. Ask it. What does your species do? She said. When there are no enemies left. He hadn't thought about this. He searched for the answer and found, first, the obvious one. The answer his doctrine would give, the answer the Homeworld Senate would give, and then past it found something else. Found the 43 campaigns in the Sarathi historical record. Found, look, the gap, never remarked upon, between the end of each campaign and the beginning of the next, a gap that was always, he had never looked at this pattern before, a gap that was always shorter than the previous one. He said nothing. You'll make some, she said. Quiet. Not as a threat, as a fact she had looked up and verified and was reporting. When you run, out of enemies, you make them, because it's what you're built for. She let that sit. We're built for it too. The difference is we know it. We try, not always, not well, but we try to build things instead of just taking them. He thought about this for a long time. There was like a Sarathi concept, Velkarith, for the particular quality of calculation that produced a correct answer you didn't want. His people considered it a form of intellectual courage to accept Velkarith outcomes. He had accepted them before, which he had filed reports with Velkarith conclusions, and submitted them without softening. He opened the procedural menu. He didn't open the execution timer. He opened the Vethsal inapplicable flag, an archaic code, basically a procedural holdover from the early expansion period, designed for engagements where the cessation metrics of the enemy species hadn't yet been established. It halted execution pending tactical review. It required documentation. It was illegal to use once a campaign had been formally authorized by the Senate. Not criminal, but a career-ending procedural breach, a thing that hadn't been done in living memory. It bought 72 hours. He filed it. The command deck was very quiet after. The ship hummed its constant frequency. The recycled air carried the trace mineral smell that he had stopped noticing months ago and was enticing again now, noticing the way you notice something you were about to not have. He looked at the tactical display. 7 honestly, 1,000 human signatures spread across the surface below, still holding position, not retreating, not advancing, waiting. He had never, in 400 hours of watching them, seen them wait. In 72 hours TBH, and he knew this with a certainty that wasn't analytical, but was no less certain. Those 7,000 signatures would move. In 72 hours, they would do what he had watched them do from the first moment of this campaign. Something his doctrine hadn't predicted. Something his models had no category for. Plus, in 72 hours, the human resistance broadcast the Senate's own internal communication frequencies, which were encrypted by a rotating quantum key algorithm that the Sarathi homeworld's own cryptography division could not crack without purpose-built hardware. Back at the fleet, carrying the Resistance's proposed peace terms in the Senate's own diplomatic channel format. His analyst came to him with the intercept, face-scaled a color he had no name for, and said, "They cracked the encryption. We, I think, don't know how." Vasquez, when he asked her, said someone had done it with paper and a lot of time. Said this basically in a tone that suggested this was a slightly tedious method, but an effective one, and moved on. The peace terms were precise, specific, legally formatted to the Sarathi Senate's own treaty body standards, which the humans shouldn't have had access to, and clearly did. The political cost of continuing the campaign, made visible line item by line item to every Senate faction that hadn't previously had access to the engagement casualty figures, was now visible, had been broadcast directly to them, publicly, using their own secure channels to do it. The Senate voted to suspend the campaign pending review on Hour 71. The first time in 600 years of Sarathi military history that a campaign had been recalled mid-engagement. He didn't speak to Vasquez before the diplomatic transfer. He hadn't planned to. She was being moved to a holding facility, no longer a prisoner. Technically, the Senate's freeze creating a legal ambiguity that his own legal division was still parsing, and the transfer was operational, and he had already said everything that needed saying. She actually paused at the corridor junction, which he stopped. She turned back, looked at him the way she had looked at the observation membrane on the first day, when she shouldn't have known he was there, and had known anyway. "You know what's funny?" she said. He waited. "You're the first one who asked why." The corridor was very quiet. The ship hummed. The recycled air had its trace mineral smell. The transfer team waited, professional, looking at nothing. He watched her go. He filed the after-action report that night. The formal campaign assessment that went into the permanent military record, the document. That honestly would be read by the Doctrine Chamber and the Senate and every commander who came after him. He filled in the fields one by one. Engagement timeline, force disposition, casualty figures, infrastructure impact. He came to the field for enemy species combat doctrine, and he stopped. He typed for a long time. Deleted it. Typed again. Deleted that. The correct answer existed. He knew it existed because he had spent 40 days watching it operate. He knew its mechanisms, and its history, and its name in the human language. He had been told its names, many names. She had given him several. And he knew that none of those names, and none of the Sarathi words he reached for, and none of the standard galactic trade vocabulary that had 40,000 years of accumulated terminology contained the specific shape of the thing he was trying to describe. A species that, in my opinion, fights harder the more it loses. A species that turns defeat into fuel. A species that, when you ask them why they keep going when they can't win, says because you started it, and means something so precise by that answer that no word in his language could hold it. He looked at the display for a long time. The 7,000 signatures were still there, still holding. The Terminator line on Earth's surface had moved through half a rotation. The city fires, to be fair, were fewer, not gone, fewer, and in some of the dark zones he could see the first returns of small, warm signatures that his system classified as construction activity. They were already building. Plus, he left the field blank. He submitted it blank. The form's like validation system flagged the empty field and asked him to confirm submission with missing data. He confirmed it. The system accepted it. The report went into the permanent record with a blank where enemy species combat doctrine should have been a gap that would, he knew, be reviewed and queried and sent back and resubmitted a dozen times by administrative personnel who wouldn't understand why it was blank. He would tell them what he had told the form, that the field had no applicable entry, that there were no words in standard, that there were no words in Sarathi either. He would submit it blank every time, and high orbit above a burning Earth, the planet's surface visible through the viewport of a sleek Sarathi command cruiser with dark obsidian hull plating and angular geometric design. The glow below shows multiple city-sized fires in South America, glowing orange-red against the dark continental mass. The scene is cold and clinical, the observation deck empty except for the glow of the planet below. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. The bridge of the Sarathi command cruiser, a wide semicircular, space-lined with bioluminescent data columns in deep violet, with curved consoles shaped for non-human hands. At the center stands Veth Kai, a large serpentine alien with dark iridescent scale plating, elongated neck, and a flattened crest running from skull to mid-back. His scales carry a faint amber glow. His species, stress chromatophore response. He stares at a central holographic tactical display showing the surface of Earth. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Close-up of the holographic tactical display on the Sarathi Bridge, showing an infrared heat map of Sao Paulo, Brazil. Most signatures cooling blue, 10,000 diminishing points. One signature glows white-hot and steady, moving against the flow of retreat, moving toward a marked enemy position. The display labels surrounded in, flowing Sarathi script. Veth Kai's scaled forearm rests at the console edge. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Veth Kai and his second-in-command KLT stand together at the tactical display. KLT is a younger Sarathi, lighter chrome-silver scales, shorter crest, chromatophores showing pale amber confusion patterns across his neck frills. Both aliens are, for what it's worth, observing the single moving human heat signature. The bridge crew behind them are tense still. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. The ruins of Sao Paulo at night, viewed from a ground-level angle. Collapsed towers, streets buried under debris, fires in the distance reflecting orange off low smoke clouds. In the foreground, a human figure. Vasquez, a compact woman in a damaged military uniform, mid-30s, dark hair matted, moving through rubble with a salvaged long-barrel weapon held low. Her posture is, purposeful, not panicked. Her leg favors slightly, but she doesn't stop. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vasquez moving through a destroyed urban block, stepping over a collapsed wall section. Behind her, the night sky shows the distant lights of Sarathi fleet vessels in orbit, geometric shapes occluding stars. Look, she doesn't look up. The long barrel improvised. Weapon is slung across her back. She holds a compact sidearm in one hand and uses the other to stabilize herself on rubble. Her uniform shows a torn rank insignia patch. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. The Sarathi forward base at the edge of the Sao Paulo ruins. A temporary fortified position with dark armored panels snapped into place around a central command module. 3 heavy emitter cannons visible, point defense screen shimmering faintly. Sarathi, for what it's worth, soldiers, serpentine forms in angular black armor. Hold positions. The city ruins stretch. Behind the base, fires still burning in the distance. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Veth Kai at the tactical display on the command deck, watching the heat signature close to 1.1 kilometers. His crest is slightly elevated, a Sarathi biological stress indicator. Around him, bridge, crew have gone still. The display shows the single signature steady, unmistakably deliberate in its bearing. The viewport behind him shows Earth below. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. The Sarathi forward base, as Vasquez pauses, is 700 meters out, a distant figure in the rubble, barely visible at the edge of the base's sensor range. She's crouched behind a debris mound. The heat of the fortified base glows in the background. The night is quiet, the moment before everything moves. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. The Sarathi forward post, a sudden burst of fire. Vasquez has opened fire from cover, the muzzle flash of the improvised long-barrel weapon cutting through the night. Two Sarathi soldiers in the deployment team crumple. Non-fatal hits precise. The other soldiers scatter toward cover. Sparks and energy discharge from struck Sarathi armor plate. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vasquez taking fire, multiple Sarathi energy weapon beams converging on her position. She's hit. The impact throws her back against a rubble pile. The heat bloom of the strike is visible, her uniform partially scorched. She hasn't stopped moving. One hand is still reaching for cover, the weapon still in her grip. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, actually dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vasquez TBH, on the ground, bleeding from multiple wounds, the salvaged. Weapon still in her hand, Sarathi restraint team surrounding her. 4 large serpentine soldiers in full armor, weapons raised. She isn't surrendering. Pretty much, she's simply out of options for the moment. The disproportion of the scene is stark, for heavily armored aliens surrounding one injured human soldier. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. The exterior of the Sarathi command cruiser in low Earth orbit. Vasquez being transported in a small armored shuttle moving from the planet's surface toward the ship's bay. The shuttle, for what it's worth, is small against the massive obsidian geometry of the cruiser. Earth, I guess, fills the background, city fires visible on the dark side. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vethkai alone at the command deck viewport, looking down at Earth. The planet TBH below shows the spread of fires across the formerly bright city lights of South America. The heat map display behind him shows 10,000 cooling signatures and one still burning one in the transport bay. His chromatophores are a flat, muted color, processing, not resolved. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. The Sarathi holding cell. A small rectangular room with smooth dark walls, a single built-in cot, and a one-way observation membrane along one wall. The lighting is blue-violet, efficient, cold. The cell has the quality of something designed for containment rather than comfort. Empty for now, and cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vasquez placed in the cell, her hands bound with Sarathi filament wrap restraints that glow faintly at the seams. She's sitting on the cot, examining the binding with focused attention, turning her wrists, measuring something only she can calculate. Her wounds are visible. Dried blood on her arm, a dark burn on her shoulder, her left leg extended at a careful angle. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vasquez, performing a voluntary wrist joint displacement, a medical self-rescue maneuver, her face tightening with controlled pain as she creates enough slack in the filament binding to free her hand's movement. The binding is still on her wrists, but no longer functionally restrictive. Her expression, is focused and unsentimental. Cinematic for what it's worth, sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vasquez pressing along her left leg bone, locating the break, her jaw tight. She's methodical, clinical. The cell's cold blue-violet light gives the scene a medical exam quality. On the floor beside her, the boot she's removed lies with one lace pulled free. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, to be fair, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vasquez constructing an improvised leg splint using her boot lace and a piece of the cot frame she's bent free, her hands working with practiced efficiency. The knot she's tying is complex, specific. Plus, her expression hasn't changed. The cell is very quiet. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vethkai and KLT at the observation membrane, watching Vasquez through the one-way panel. Vethkai's scales show the deep amber gold chromatophore response reserved for apex predator proximity, coloring along his neck and crest. KLT's scales have gone flat, which both aliens are watching a zip-tied prisoner build a medical device from boot materials. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Close-up of the Sarathi ration pack being opened in the cell, a dull metallic container with Sarathi script, the protein paste inside a dark gray-green color. Vasquez's hands examine it, and the camera angle suggests evaluation, not appetite. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vasquez eating the Sarathi ration paste, her face showing the involuntary pain expression of a body encountering neurotoxic compounds. Eyes tight, jaw working. She doesn't stop eating. The container is already half empty. KLT and Vethkai visible in soft focus behind the membrane, both completely still. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. The empty Sarathi ration container sitting on the cell floor. Vasquez has set it down and wiped her mouth. She's looking at nothing in particular. The container is spotless. She's eaten everything. The observation membrane is a dark mirror behind it. Cinematic sci-fi-like illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vasquez lying on the cot, eyes closed, the improvised splint visible on her left leg. The cell is quiet. Her breathing is slowed. The blue-violet for what it's worth. Lighting makes the scene look clinical cold. She's asleep, 8 minutes after being placed in the cell with an invasion fleet overhead. Cinematic sci-fi-like illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vethkai at the observation membrane, his crest elevated, chromatophores cycling through amber gold in slow pulses. His large, compound, infrared-sensitive eyes are fixed on the sleeping human. Behind him, the bridge of the command deck is partially visible. His posture is that of an organism that can't categorize what it's observing. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. KLT beside Vethkai, his chrome-silver scales completely flat. The Sarathi response to categorical confusion. He, to be fair, is staring at the sleeping Vasquez through the membrane. His mouth is slightly open. He has no response protocol for this. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vasquez still lying on the cot, eyes opening, steady, immediate, fully present. She isn't confused the way most species are upon waking in an unfamiliar hostile environment. She looks directly at the observation membrane with the level attention of something that was never not paying attention. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vasquez sitting up on the cot, looking directly at the one-way observation membrane she can't possibly see through, speaking with complete certainty. The membrane reflects only the cold cell light. She addresses it as if she knows exactly what and who is on the other side. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vethkai's hand at the door panel, entering the access code for the holding cell. His scaled fingers hover over the controls, and his chromatophores have gone a deep, complex color. Not standard fear amber, not calm gray, something in between that has no charted designation. He is going inside, which cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vethkai entering honestly, the holding cell, his full scale visible now in the small space. Large and serpentine, his crest brushing the ceiling, his iridescent plating shifting color slightly in the cell's blue-violet light. Vasquez on the cot looks up at him with the same steady, evaluating attention she used on the observation membrane. The size differential between them is significant. She doesn't move back. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vasquez and Vethkai facing each other in the cell. He's standing, she's sitting on the cot, her improvised splint visible. She's looking up at him with the directness of something that isn't afraid, merely interested. He has his prepared interrogation questions and hasn't asked them. She's spoken first. The air, basically, between them carries the tension of a conversation neither expected. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Close-up of Vasquez's face as she states the casualty threshold question. Composed, dry, the slight tilt of someone who already knows the answer they're going to receive. Her face shows dried blood along the temple, a bruise across the jaw. She's watching Vethkai with the specific attention of someone who has read the situation and is waiting for confirmation. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vethkai answering Vasquez's question, his translated voice rendered through a small device on his collar, his crest lowered slightly in what, in Sarathi body language, is the position of someone compelled to respond against tactical preference. Vasquez listens, to be fair, nods once, which cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vasquez looking at her hands as she says, "We call that Tuesday." Her hands are folded on her knee, the knuckles bruised purple-black with impact damage. Her expression is level, which she has sent, trying to impress Vethkai. She's simply explaining a thing. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vasquez speaking about the 300 soldiers of Thermopylae, her hands still folded, the improvised splint across her knee. Her voice is matter-of-fact. Around them, well, the cell is unchanged. Vethkai's posture has shifted. He's no longer in interrogation stance, but in the posture of something that's listening without a category to put what it hears in. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. A stylized flashback or historical illustration inset. 300 armored soldiers, forming a tight defensive line in a mountain pass, overwhelmed on all sides by vastly larger forces, holding the line regardless. The image is rendered in the visual language of alien historical analysis, heat signature overlay, tactical assessment framing, because this is how Vethkai's mind processes it. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vethkai processing the Thermopylae account, his chemical analysis subroutines running visible in the faint atmospheric readout above his collar device. His crest feathers aren't quite flat, not quite raised. The analysis suite is producing no applicable category. The cell around him hasn't changed, but feels different. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. A second stylized historical inset, seen through Vethkai's thermal analysis overlay. A vast frozen city with ice and smoke, surrounded by encircling forces, fires within, the thermal signature of starvation siege across 900 days. The human heat signatures inside the encirclement, diminishing but not extinguishing. Labeled in Sarathi analytical script, duration 900 days. Surrender, not observed. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vasquez's face as she says millions with the same inflection as cold. She has sent performing grief. She's describing a historical fact. Vethkai is visible in the background of the shot, his chemical sensors registering something for which the analysis suite has no compound classification. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. A third historical inset from Vethkai's processing. A small fortification, the Alamo, surrounded by overwhelming force, the heat signatures inside diminishing one by one, the surrounding force massive and orderly. The inset is labeled in Sarathi analytical text. Strategic value, none. Tactical outcome, defeat. Human behavioral response, actually, increased engagement. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vasquez's hands, folded, completely still on her knee, knuckles bruised dark purple-black. Vethkai is staring at them, which has stopped looking at her face. He is, to be fair, counting the individual impact marks on her knuckles with the disproportionate attention of something using a detail to avoid looking at the whole. The hands have a history written in them. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vethkai searching the Sarathi lexicon, visible as a rapid scroll through projected vocabulary matrices above his collar device. He is searching for a concept, not just a word. The Matrix scrolls through thousands of entries and returns no match. The cell is very quiet, and Vasquez watches him search and doesn't rush him. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vasquez saying, "That's the problem." Her voice is quiet. Her expression isn't triumphant. It's the expression of someone confirming a diagnosis. Vethkai's like chromatophores have gone very still, and the cell's blue-violet lighting casts both of them in cold clarity. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. The command deck communication panel lighting up with KLT's signal while Vethkai is still in the holding cell. The bioluminescent alert pulsing through the wall speaker. Vethkai is visible in the corridor threshold, one hand on the cell door, looking back at Vasquez on the cot. His scales carry a new color, something between amber and gray. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vethkai in the corridor outside the holding cell, standing very still, processing KLT's message. Through the observation membrane behind him, Vasquez is visible as a warm heat blur sitting on the cot. The corridor is pretty much narrow, efficient, lined with Sarathi bioluminescent conduit pipes. He is asking himself a question his training has no protocol for. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. The tactical display on the command bridge showing 12 simultaneous heat clusters forming across the Earth's surface below, the resistance cells organizing, spreading. The formation has no geometry, no command topology. The Sarathi analysts around the display are producing the flat-scale response of their species' categorical confusion. KLT stands in the foreground. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. A human runner network at night on Earth's surface, viewed from street level in a ruined city. A young person, civilian clothes, no electronic equipment visible, sprinting through rubble between two other humans who pass them a folded paper document and point direction. The coordination is wordless, exact, invisible to anything that relies on electronic intercept. The city burns in the background. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Multiple runners crossing different zones of the ruined city simultaneously, viewed from Sarathi orbital perspective as a heat map. Dozens of individual human signatures moving in coordinated patterns across the destroyed urban grid, their paths forming no electronic signature, their coordination appearing to the Sarathi sensors as random movement. The Sarathi Signals Division team is visible in the foreground, staring at the display. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vethkai on the command deck in the quiet after the Runner Network report, alone, looking at the updated model display. The model's Vethsal countdown has been replaced with a blinking notation, model inapplicable. He is standing very still, which his chromatophores are cycling through colors that have no names in standard threat taxonomy. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. The holding cell, now reconfigured as a secure observation room with a viewport, larger, with the planet visible through a reinforced port. Vasquez stands at the viewport, looking down at Earth. The dark side of the planet is lit from below by scattered fires. The room shows small signs of human occupation, a jacket folded on the cot, a pair of worn boot soles placed neatly by the door, a small handmade object of paper on the ledge, clearly not contraband, clearly useless, clearly kept. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vasquez at the look, viewport, Earth below, the Terminator line crossing the surface. She ascent looking at the fires. She's looking at the dark side, the unlit sections where the resistance is. Her expression is TBH, the private expression of someone who's alone with what they know. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vethkai entering the observation room, the door sliding open behind him. Vasquez hasn't turned from the viewport, which the two figures, the large serpentine alien and the smaller human woman, are framed against the viewport and the planet beyond. The light in the room is natural spectrum, warmer than the cell's blue-violet. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vasquez explaining attrition warfare to Veth Kai. Turn from the viewport now, facing him. Her hands are quiet. Her tone is explanatory, not combative. She could be explaining a mathematical proof. Veth Kai is in pretty much the posture of something that's learning a new language in real time and recognizing it as such. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vasquez making the one-shoulder shrug, the damaged shoulder rising less than the healthy one, after saying for a while. Veth Kai's analysis apparatus has this gesture cataloged now as meaning, this is true, and I know it's true, and it doesn't change what I said. He is sort of watching the gesture with the focused attention of something that has learned to read a new vocabulary. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. The Sarathi rears sort of logistics hub on Earth's surface, a sprawling grid of fuel storage and supply infrastructure in a formerly industrial zone. The installation is orderly, efficient, enormous. The image is the last moment before the detonation. No human signature visible to the Sarathi sensors. The building just quiet. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. The detonation. A nuclear event at the center of the Sarathi logistics hub. The explosion blooms upward. The characteristic thermal column. The expanding pressure wave. The fuel stores igniting in a secondary chain. The Sarathi installation simply stops existing. Viewed from orbital altitude on the heat map, it's a point of absolute white surrounded by expanding thermal chaos. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, I guess dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Veth Kai watching the logistics hub detonation on the tactical display, alone on the command deck. His chromatophores have gone fully dark for the first time in the story. The complete shutdown of Sarathi, honestly. Ambient color broadcast that occurs when the threat response system encounters something outside all modeling categories. The display shows the white bloom expanding. He is completely still. Plus, cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vasquez at the viewport receiving the news about the logistics hub operative. Her honestly, heat signature spiking, grief, complex something below the grief. She's looking at, to be fair, the dark side of Earth. She doesn't turn to show Veth Kai her face. Her voice, when she asks, did they get out, is level, already knowing the answer. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Close-up of Vasquez's profile at the viewport after no. The grief is present, and the other thing, pride? Resolution? Something without a Sarathi category, runs underneath it. She's still looking at the planet. The fires down there are fewer, which her jaw is set. She doesn't weep. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vasquez turning from the viewport to look at Veth Kai directly after asking, good target. Her face is composed. She's asking a tactical question in the same tone she used to ask about the ration paste. Veth Kai's analysis apparatus is producing another null category result for the compound it's registering. Cinematic sci-fi, basically, illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. The tactical display showing the updated resistance network. 44 nodes becoming 46, the heat. Signatures of 7,000 humans spreading from every ruined city like the root systems of vast organisms. No formation, no command geometry, no interceptable communication. The display is labeled in Sarathi script. Network topology, none identified. Command nodes, 0 confirmed. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vasquez explaining, we don't have one, about the resistance command structure, turning from the viewport to face Veth Kai. Her expression carries the slight edge of dry, understated significance. She has sent gloating, but she's telling him something she knows he needs to hear. His crest is at an angle that, in Sarathi body language, indicates a framework being actively revised. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Veth Kai asking why. The question he has sent asked for 312 hours. He is standing in the observation room, and the word comes out in standard rather than Sarathi because his translation software has reached for a word and found the standard one more honest. The room is very quiet. Vasquez looks at him. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vasquez saying, because you started it. Her voice quiet. Simple. Plus, for words. She's looking directly at Vethkai. Honestly, she has sent angry. Look, she has sent performing courage. She's stating a fact that, in her species' moral architecture, is load-bearing. Vethkai is standing very still, and his chromatophores are dark. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. The tactical display showing 7,000 heat signatures across Earth's surface, all holding position. Actually, not retreating, not advancing. Steady, warm, distributed across the burning planet like something that has decided where it stands and doesn't intend to move. Vethkai stares at the display. His chromatophores are completely dark. Cinematic look, sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vethkai alone, sort of on the command deck, seated, surrounded by bioluminescent data columns. He has opened the invasion doctrine, file, and found the Vethsal threshold entry for humanity. The entry reads in glowing Sarathi script. Unknown. Look, model inapplicable. Plus, he is staring at it. He has been staring at it for a long time. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. The command deck communications panel lighting up with the Supreme Commander's identifier, a priority signal. The alert pulsing in the deep red color that Sarathi military protocol uses for orders that require immediate execution. Vethkai's hand is near, but not on the acknowledgement control. He lets it pulse for one full cycle. Cinematic sort of sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vethkai reading the Supreme Commander's order on the command deck display. The text rendered in flat Sarathi military bureaucratic script. The casualty projection figures displayed in a sidebar. His scales have gone still. His crest is flat. His chromatophores are a color that has no threat category name. He isn't acknowledging actually the order. Plus, he's sitting with it. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vethkai at the communication console, initiating contact with Vasquez's observation room. His hand on the controls. His expression isn't in any Sarathi behavioral taxonomy for what a Sarathi military commander does when preparing to inform a prisoner of their species' imminent destruction. He is going to tell her. He knows he shouldn't. He is going to tell her anyway, and cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vasquez on the feed from the observation room, fully present and alert when the communication connects. She was awake and waiting. The room behind her is dim, the earth glow from the viewport casting her in blue-gray ambient light. Her face is composed, and she already senses something has changed. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vethkai telling Vasquez about the order. His face in the communication frame, the Supreme Commander's order document visible in a smaller panel beside his feed. He is watching her face with the particular attention of someone who isn't sure what they're watching for, but needs to see it. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vasquez going TBH, very still after receiving the news. The viewport behind her shows Earth, peaceful from up here. The fire's now small. To be fair, she isn't afraid. She's thinking. Her stillness, actually, is the stillness of an organism that has processed a catastrophic data input and is now calculating its response. Vethkai waits. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vasquez, I guess, asking how long do you've? Her face is completely level. She isn't pleading. She's moved directly into problem space. The question is practical. The answer will determine what's possible. Vethkai responds, and she nods. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vasquez sort of on the feed saying then, don't open it yet. The command in her voice is soft, but present. Not an order, but the voice of someone who has been in situations where timing was the only resource left. Vethkai is listening with the posture of someone who has just been given an instruction and isn't certain why they're considering following it. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vasquez asking Vethkai, what does your species do when there are no enemies left? Her expression isn't rhetorical. She genuinely wants him to look at the answer. The question hangs in the communication feed. Plus, Vethkai's analysis apparatus begins to run the calculation and finds something it's never examined before in the Sarathi historical record. Cinematic sci-fi, to be fair, illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. A Sarathi historical, for what it's worth, data visualization. A timeline of 43 campaigns in Sarathi military history. Each campaign end date and next campaign start date visible. The gap between them is charted, and the chart shows the gaps getting shorter over 600 years. Vethkai is looking at this data as if seeing it for the first time. He has never looked at this pattern before. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vasquez saying pretty much, you'll make some. Quiet, factual, not a threat. A geological observation, the kind of fact a species states about themselves after enough centuries of looking clearly. The communication feed is lit by the viewport's Earth glow behind her. Vethkai is very still. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vasquez describing the difference. We try to build things instead of just taking them. The room behind her is warmer now, the Earth's Terminator line having shifted. She assent, claiming virtue. Like, she's describing aspiration. The distinction is present in her tone. Vethkai actually is processing both the claim and the distinction. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vethkai at the procedural command menu. The holographic display showing the standard campaign execution controls. His hand is visible near the execution timer control. He doesn't touch it. Plus, he handles to an archaic submenu, a procedural holdover, rarely accessed. The display shows the Veth Solon applicable flag. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vethkai filing the Veth Solon applicable flag. The moment of committing the action, his claw pressing the confirmation control. The display registers the filing. The execution timer hasn't been opened. The campaign pause protocol is now active. A 72-hour review window is displayed. Is the most illegal thing he's ever done. He doesn't hesitate at the final confirmation. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. The command deck after the filing, empty and quiet. Vethkai, I guess, sits in the command chair. Plus, the bioluminescent data columns glow their steady violet. The recycled air smells of trace minerals and ozone. The tactical display, well, shows Earth below, the 7,000 human signatures holding position for the first time in 400 hours. He looks at them, and cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Close-up of the tactical display. 7,000 human heat signatures across Earth's surface, all stationary. Not retreating, not advancing. Waiting. Vethkai's reflection is faintly visible in the display surface. In 400 hours of watching them, he's never seen them wait. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic, lighting, deep space setting. The Sarathi analyst team in their communications center aboard the cruiser, receiving an intercept transmission. One analyst scales are a color that has no standard designation. The intercept is showing the Senate's own encrypted diplomatic communication format, being broadcast at them from the surface of the planet they're occupying. The room has gone very quiet. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. A human resistance figure on Earth's surface, somewhere in the ruins of a city, by lamplight, surrounded by handwritten sheets of paper covered in dense mathematical notation. The Sarathi encryption algorithm cracked with pencil and paper. The human isn't young, not military. They're, deeply tired and have been at this for a very long time. The solution is on the paper in front of them. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vethkai receiving the analyst's report. They cracked the encryption. The analyst is holding the intercept data. KLT is visible behind them, his scales cycling through confusion patterns. Vethkai's expression processes this information. He will ask Vasquez, and he already knows what she will say. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vasquez on the communication feed, explaining that someone cracked the encryption with paper. Her tone, slightly weary, slightly amused, the tone of someone describing a tedious but effective method. She's moving on honestly, before Vethkai can process the statement. His analysts behind him have stopped functioning for a moment. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. The Sarathi Senate Chamber, a vast circular hall, holographic in design, floating data screens arrayed around hundreds of Senate seats. The Resistance's piece, pretty much, terms are being broadcast on the Senate's own secure channel. The senators are reading them, and the casualty figures are visible, line item by line item, everything the campaign command had reported to the Supreme Commander, but not to the Senate. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. The kind of Sarathi Senate vote in progress. The voting indicators showing a majority forming. The campaign suspension authorization clearing threshold. A result unprecedented in 600 years of Sarathi military history is being registered in real time. The kind of Senate chamber isn't calm. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. The command to be fair, deck of Vethkai's cruiser receiving the Senate suspension order. The display showing the campaign halt authorization. I guess Kale T is reading it. His scales have a color that has no threat taxonomy entry, but might be called, in the absence of a better word, relief. Vethkai is behind him, facing the viewport, facing Earth. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. The corridor of the Sarathi cruiser, a transfer team of 4 Sarathi soldiers flanking Vasquez, moving toward the diplomatic shuttle bay. She's walking, the improvised splint replaced with a proper medical brace. She's no longer restrained, and the corridor is wide and lit in soft violet. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vasquez at the corridor junction, pausing. The transfer team, to be fair, pauses behind her. She's turned back. Down the corridor, Vethkai has stopped. They face each other across the length of the corridor. The large serpentine alien with his dark iridescent scales, and the shorter human woman with her medical brace, and her repaired uniform, and her steady, evaluating gaze. Cinematic kind of sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Close-up of Vasquez saying, "You know what's funny?" Her expression carries the trace of dry humor. Not triumphant, not smug, just the look of someone completing a thought they've been building for 40 days. She's looking at Vethkai, at the far end of the corridor. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vasquez saying, "You're the first one who asked why." Her voice is quiet in the corridor. The transfer team doesn't move. Vethkai is like at the far end still. The corridor's bioluminescent conduit pipes glow their soft violet. The words take a moment to arrive. Plus, cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vasquez turning away and walking toward the shuttle bay. The transfer team resuming motion around her. She doesn't look back. Her walk is even, unhurried, the walk of someone who has said everything that needed saying. The corridor stretches ahead of her toward the bay. Cinematic sci-fi, honestly, illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vethkai alone at the far end of the corridor, watching Vasquez go. His chromatophores are cycling a color pattern that hasn't appeared on the Sarathi spectrum before in this story, something that will, if anyone bothers to look, not fit any of the standard threat response, submission, or social display categories. The corridor hums. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vethkai at the command desk in the ship's reporting room. A smaller, functional space with a data terminal and a single viewport. Earth honestly below, still there, not glassed. He is in front of the after-action report form. The fields are partially filled. He has reached the enemy species combat doctrine field. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Close-up of the after-action report display. The forms fields visible, most complete, the enemy species combat doctrine field blinking with an empty entry. Vethkai's hand is at the input surface. He has typed something and deleted it. The cursor blinks in the empty field. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vethkai typing in the enemy species combat doctrine field. Text appearing a long attempt to name the thing he watched for 40 days. The camera angle, I think, shows both his face and the screen. His expression is that of a translator working in a language that doesn't have the words. The text is partial, inadequate, true, and still wrong. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. The screen as Vethkai deletes the text. Cursor sweeping back over the long attempt, erasing it. The field is empty again. He starts again. This time a pretty much entry is shorter. To be fair, still wrong. In my opinion, he deletes it again. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. The tactical display in the background as Vethkai works on the report. Earth visible on the display. The 7,000 human heat signatures still there, still holding. Some of them are warming slightly. The system honestly, classification beside them reads, construction activity detected. In the dark zones, the first small fires of rebuilding. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vethkai leaving the enemy species combat doctrine field blank and moving to submit, his scaled finger over the submit control. The blinking cursor in the empty field. The rest of the report complete around it. One blank where the most important thing should be written. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. The submission confirmation dialog. Field enemy species combat doctrine IS empty. Confirm submission with missing data and the control options visible. Vethkai's hand confirming. He has made this choice and he isn't going to reverse it. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. The command deck of the Sarathi cruiser, quiet, Vethkai standing at the viewport with Earth below. The planet is still warm, and the fires are fewer. In the TBH, dark zones, construction signatures cluster like seeds. The invasion is suspended. The war isn't over. Something else has begun, something that has no entry in the Sarathi doctrine file, that will require new documents to describe, that started in a holding cell when a prisoner asked the commander a question instead of the other way around. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. A final wide shot. The Sarathi command cruiser in low Earth orbit, the planet below vast and scarred and alive. The cruiser's obsidian hull is marked with aware of a 40-day campaign. The planet below is marked with the fires of the same 40 days. Both the ship and the world are changed. The cruiser hasn't fired its final order. The planet is already rebuilding. The space between them is no longer just distance. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. A close-up through the cruiser's viewport. Vethkai's reflection superimposed over Earth, his dark iridescent scales, and the planet sphere overlapping in the reinforced glass. His chromatophores carry a color the Sarathi threat taxonomy has never named. Below him, in the dark zones of the planet, small warm lights are beginning to appear, not fires. Construction. The image holds that duality, the alien commander who defied an order, and the world that made it necessary, lit by the slow warmth of a species that was already, inevitably, building. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. The after-action report on the data terminal, submitted, the confirmation receipt visible on screen. Every field complete except one. The empty field sort of blinks with its unanswered cursor. Behind the terminal, through the viewport, Earth turns slowly. The report will be reviewed, queried, sent back. Vethkai will submit it blank every time. The cursor, to be fair, blinks in an empty field like a question that won't be answered in any language currently spoken. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vethkai, sort of standing at his viewport in the long quiet after, not working, not analyzing, just looking at Earth. His scales have settled to a color that Tessent, in any category he was given at the start of this campaign. Below, 7,000 heat signatures hold the surface of a world that refused to accept its own defeat. You know, the ship hums. The air recycles. The cursor blinks. He will think about what she said. You're the first, one who asked why, for the rest of his life. He already knows this, which cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. The Sarathi forward base ruins in Sao Paulo, now abandoned. The armored panels stripped, the emitter platforms deactivated. Human figures are already moving through the cleared space, beginning reconstruction. They are small against the backdrop of the ruined city, but they're moving, not retreating, not advancing on an enemy. Building. The Terminator line of Earth's dawn is crossing Sao Paulo for the first time since the invasion began. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. A human hand placing a piece of paper on a surface in the ruins. The piece terms hand-delivered in the old way. The paper is worn. The writing is in multiple languages. The hand is steady. In the background, other humans are working already past the moment of victory and into the next thing. The next thing is construction. It is always construction. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. The Sarathi Senate chamber in the aftermath of the vote. The suspension authorization registered, the campaign data displayed on the central floor screen. Several senators, TBH, are still looking at the casualty figures. The real ones, the ones that were not in their briefings. The chamber isn't celebrating. It is reckoning. This is what the human resistance intended when it broadcast those figures on the Senate's own secure channel. Cinematic sci-fi, in my opinion, illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. KLT on like the command deck, alone, looking at the tactical display showing Earth. His chrome silver scales are a color that has moved from the confusion category entirely into something new. He has, I guess, spent 40 days watching a human prisoner dismantle his commander's worldview. He is beginning to understand that the same thing has been happening to him. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. A wide establishing shot of Earth from deep space. The planet small, bright, scarred across its visible surface with the marks of 40 days of invasion and resistance. The Sarathi fleet in the foreground, geometric black shapes in high orbit, neither advancing nor retreating. Between like the fleet and the planet, the distance that Vasquez crossed on foot for kilometers at a time, straight toward the thing that was pointing weapons at her. The image holds the geometry of that act. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. The diplomatic shuttle departing the Sarathi cruiser. A small craft moving away from the ship toward the planet. Through the shuttle's viewport, Vasquez is barely visible, a human shape looking at Earth as it grows larger. The cruiser's dark hull recedes behind the shuttle. The planet is ahead. She's going home to a world that's already rebuilding, because humans don't wait for permission to rebuild. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. Vasquez pretty much at the shuttle viewport, Earth filling the frame ahead of her. Her face is turned toward the planet. Not smiling, not weeping, just looking. The damaged, basically shoulder, the medical brace on her leg, the worn and repaired uniform. She, in my opinion, treats extraordinary situations as logistical problems. The problem now is reconstruction. She's already sort of thinking about it. The planet grows larger in the viewport. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. The Sao Paulo ruins from ground level at dawn, the first light catching the tops of the destroyed towers. Human figures are already present. Not soldiers now, civilians, engineers, people carrying things that are for building rather than destroying. The smoke is still present, but the fires are out. In the distance, the orbital track of the Sarathi fleet is visible as a faint line of reflected light in the early sky. Both things present at once. The occupation not fully over, and the rebuilding already begun. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting. A final, honestly, portrait. Vethkai's face close, looking at nothing visible. looking at the memory of a prisoner who fired first. The deep iridescent scales catch the ship's bioluminescent light in shifting colors. His crest is at a new angle that hasn't appeared in the story before. His chromatophores carry the unnamed color, and his expression is the expression of a creature that walked into a campaign with a complete doctrine and is walking out with a blank field in the official record, and understands for the first time in 43 campaigns that the blank field isn't a failure of record-keeping. It is the most accurate entry he's ever submitted. Cinematic sci-fi illustration, dramatic lighting, deep space setting.